Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today as we welcome one of Indiana University's most prolific alumni. John Dittmer is a professor emeritus of history at DePauw University and is one of the nation's premier authorities on the civil rights movement, making him a perfect addition to our Brown 60 series. This fall, we've heard from a number of scholars as we commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education. Professor Dittmar's talk today concludes our lecture series, and we could have not asked for a better guest to do so. He is a true Hoosier. He earned 3 degrees from Indiana University, eventually going on to teach at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Brown University, and DePauw University when he retired in 2003. In 1995, his book, Local People, The Struggle for Civil Rights in Mississippi, was awarded the very prestigious Bancroft Prize, which recognizes the best American history writing. He is also the author of Black Georgia in the Progressive Era, 1900 to 1920, and his most recent work is titled The Good Doctors, the Medical Committee for Human Rights and the Struggle for Social Justice in Healthcare. While Professor Dittmar's talk today concludes our Brown at 60 series, we will host a screening of American Promise on Monday at the IU Cinema. That event will begin at 7 p.m., and I encourage all of you to see what's truly an incredible documentary. Tickets for that are free, and you can pick them up at the IU Cinema box office during normal business hours or beginning at 6:30, I understand, on Monday evening. As we conclude this semester's events, I especially want to send a special thank you to IU's Office for Diversity, Equity, and Multicultural Affairs and our own Maurer chapter of the American Constitution Society for their work in making this series happen. Will you please join me in a very warm welcome to Professor Dittmer.
Thank you very much. It's good to be home. I am going to talk about Mississippi today because that is the state that I know best. It, I think, is indicative of the attention that it has received. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, after the murder of Medgar Evers, said that Mississippi was the worst state. So living in Mississippi and teaching at Tougaloo College, a historically black school, for 12 years, why we saw the worst in Mississippi, but when things got a little better there, you thought, well, this is really significant. But today I'm going to talk about schools. First thing we need to know about public schools in Mississippi is that there were none prior to the Civil War. And it was against the law for slaves to learn to read and write. The Reconstruction government changed all that with blacks of all ages flocking to the new schools established by the Freedmen's Bureau and by Northern missionaries. But in 1875, whites used intimidation, violence, and murder to keep blacks away from the polls, and thereby ushered in nearly a century of racial segregation, commonly known as Jim Crow. This new regime gave support to public education, but officials made it clear from the outset that the school system would be segregated and that it would benefit primarily white children. Blacks needed to learn only the fundamentals of reading and writing, if that. Senator James K. Vardaman put it in 1899, "People talk about elevating the Negro race by education. It is not only folly, but it comes pretty close to being criminal folly. The education of a Negro only spoils a good field hand. It is money thrown away." At the turn of the 20th century, blacks comprised 60% of the school-age children, but received only 19% of the state school funds. By World War II, the gap had widened. The black 57% of the population got only 13% of the allocation. And it should be pointed out here that the state supplied most of the funding for public schools in Mississippi. Most often, blacks had to supply their own school buildings. By 1940, roughly half of all black common schools still met in tenant cabins, lodges, churches, and stores. According to the state superintendent of schools, most of them were, quote, just 4 blank unpainted walls, a few old rickety benches, an old stove propped up on brickbats, and 2 or 3 boards nailed together and painted black for a blackboard. More than 2/3 of these structures had no water supply, and well over 90% had no indoor plumbing. Black teachers were underpaid and undereducated. As late as World War II, more than half of the black elementary and secondary teachers did not even have a high school diploma, and not 1 in 10 had a college degree. White school boards controlled black schools, and teachers who stepped out of line by talking about racial matters very often lost their jobs. The needs of white students always took priority. Their school year was nearly 2 months longer. Their buildings were better. They had libraries, few black schools did, and they received free bus transportation. Now, in many counties, blacks had to pay to ride buses that passed white schools on their way to a black school in an isolated part of the county. It's not surprising then that as late as 1950, 70% of Mississippi blacks had less than a 7th grade education, and only 2.3% had finished high school. But in the aftermath of World War II, a new generation of black leaders emerged. Many of them, like Amzie Moore and Medgar Evers and Aaron Henry, were Army veterans. They began voter registration projects, started new NAACP branches, and lobbied for major changes in the way the state's educational establishment did business. Meanwhile, the NAACP's legal defense team, led by Thurgood Marshall, was at work on a string of challenges to Plessy versus Ferguson, the decision that had legitimized the separation of races in public accommodations, including schools. Aware of this challenge moving up through the courts, Mississippi elected officials decided that the best thing they could do to avoid school integration was to try to make black schools equal as well as separate. Well, sort of equal. The School Equalization Plan, as it was called, would allocate funds to counties to build new schools for blacks and increase the salaries of teachers, who made much less than their white counterparts. The legislature debated the proposal and appropriated $3 million for construction of schools. When the county got hold of that money, however, most of it went to white schools. The major problem was that Mississippi could not adequately finance one school system, let alone two. It ranked 9th among all states in the percentage of income expended on education in 1945, but it remained dead last in terms of actual tax dollars used for public education. In the end, though, before they would allocate more equalization money, the legislators decided to wait on the Supreme Court's action. On May 17, 1954, French troops were under siege at an isolated outpost named Dien Bien Phu in a little-known country called Vietnam. Officials in the Eisenhower administration were warning of a communist threat in Guatemala, calling for regime change publicly, while behind the scenes the CIA plotted the overthrow of the government of Jacobo Arbenz. In Washington, the first great televised show trial, the Army McCarthy hearings, was underway. On camera, the junior senator from Wisconsin was his usual confident, bullying self, unaware that an obscure Yankee lawyer was waiting in the wings to lay him low with the simple, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" And down the street, at the Supreme Court building, Chief Justice Earl Warren was handing down a decision, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, declaring that racially segregated schools were inherently unequal, in violation of the 14th Amendment, and therefore unconstitutional. Black Americans were elated. Thurgood Marshall recalled that when he heard the verdict, "I was so happy I was numb." Harlem's Amsterdam News explained that the Supreme Court decision is the greatest victory for the Negro people since the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Chicago Defender predicted that this means the beginning of the end of the dual society in American life and the segregation that supported it. Most white opinion makers outside the South applauded the unanimous decision. Even the ultra-conservative Indianapolis Star welcomed the court's verdict, although the editors worried over whether states' rights would be trampled in implementation. In Mississippi, the response of white spokesmen would not surprise you. The Jackson Daily News predicted that, quote, human blood may stain Southern soil in many places because of this decision, but the dark red stains of blood will be on the marble steps of the United States Supreme Court building. White and Negro children in the same schools will lead to miscegenation, the editors warned. Miscegenation leads to mixed marriages, and mixed marriages leads to mongrelization of the human race. Mississippi Senator James Eastland breathed defiance. The South will not abide by nor obey this legislative decision of a political court. We will take whatever steps are necessary to retain segregation in education. We are about to embark on a great crusade to restore Americanism. Jim Eastland, to the contrary, the court's decision was the law of the land, and the practical and crucial question was that of implementation. The court called for another hearing in the fall term. The South would have time to adjust. Initially, the reports from the border states were encouraging. The governors of Delaware, West Virginia, and Kentucky pledged to uphold the decision. Large border cities like Kansas City, Louisville, St. Louis, and Baltimore fell into line. Within a year, 70% of the school districts in these states had integrated classrooms. In May of 1955, a unanimous court once again announced what everyone would soon call Brown II. Federal district courts were to require school districts to make, quote, a prompt and reasonable start toward full compliance and to proceed with all deliberate speed. Many supporters of the 1954 decision were dismayed at the apparent ambivalence of Brown II and the oxymoronic deliberate speed. Segregationists, on the other hand, were encouraged because Southern courts would oversee the implementation. Thank God we got good federal judges, said Georgia's Lieutenant Governor, Ernest Vandiver. They are steeped in the same tradition as I am. A reasonable time can be construed as 1 year or 200. If Earl Warren and his colleagues believed that Southern elected officials would obey the law of the land, they were mistaken. And if they expected vigorous enforcement of Brown from the executive branch of the federal government, they were to be sadly disappointed. As soon as the original decision came down, reporters asked Presidential Press Secretary Jim Haggerty what his boss thought of the decision. Haggerty replied that Dwight Eisenhower had no response. In the months and years that followed, the president's silence on school desegregation was deafening. He never endorsed the decision. The most he would say publicly was that Brown was the law of the land and that he would enforce it. Privately, though, Ike was furious. On the eve of the decision, he told Earl Warren that, quote, all the opponents of desegregation are concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school with some big overgrown Negroes. Later, he complained that nominating Warren to be Chief Justice was the biggest damn mistake I've ever made. He told a speechwriter that the Supreme Court has set back progress in the South at least 15 years. It's very well to talk about school integration, if you will remember that you'll also be talking about school disintegration. And the fellow who tells you can do those things by force is just plain nuts. There are a number of explanations as to why school desegregation in the South did not go down smoothly. That, at the most crucial time, the nation's commander-in-chief went AWOL is certainly one of them. Eisenhower's silence, in effect, gave Southern political leaders the green light to oppose the mandate of the court. In Mississippi, this opposition was quick to arise, although here too at first there appeared to be possibilities for compliance. The college newspaper at Ole Miss editorialized that while the majority of the students do not want to attend school with Negroes, we feel the students will adapt themselves to it. This more than 8 years before the bloody desegregation of that university by James Meredith. In the Delta town of Cleveland, a young Episcopal priest named Duncan Gray called upon Mississippians to obey the decision and kept his job. Gray talked to the local school superintendent and the president of the school board, and both men said they believed that Cleveland schools would be desegregated within a relatively short time. But if there had been a window of opportunity in Mississippi for school integration, it quickly shut. For on July 11, 1954, less than 2 months after Brown, a 32-year-old Delta plantation manager named Tut Patterson called together a group of prominent businessmen and formed the first Citizens Council, with its primary goal the prevention of school desegregation. By the time of the court's implementation ruling a year later, council chapters had spread throughout the state. This uptown Ku Klux Klan, to quote Mississippi editor Harding Carter, was ready when the National Office of the NAACP instructed 5 of its Mississippi branches to file school desegregation petitions on behalf of local black children. In each of these communities, the local Citizen Council crushed the drive. In Yazoo City, for example, the council took out full-page newspaper ads listing the names of all 53 parents asking that their children be admitted to white schools. Almost immediately, those petitioners working for white people lost their jobs. Within a short time, all but 2 of the signers had removed their names from the list, and the remaining signatories soon left town. Similar tactics produced the same results in other cities targeted for desegregation. The national NAACP had underestimated the ferocity of the white resistance and overestimated the federal government's commitment to law enforcement. The Eisenhower administration stood by while Mississippi whites made a mockery of Brown, and repeated pleas by local and national NAA officials met a federal wall of indifference. Given the powerful segregationist opposition, unchecked by the federal government, the petitioners were sitting ducks to be picked off one by the sharpshooters of the Citizens Council. And throughout of this, a fatal flaw of the court's implementation plan became clear. By putting the onus of school desegregation on the backs of black parents rather than on the segregated school systems, the court had all but guaranteed successful opposition to compliance. But despite the Brown decision, perhaps even because of it, Mississippi leaders decided to go ahead with their school equalization program. They believed that if they showed a good faith effort to provide additional support for the education of black children, they could continue to operate 2 separate sets of schools. To that end, Governor Hugh White called a group of black leaders from across the state for a meeting in Jackson in July of 1954. His purpose was to persuade them to endorse what he called voluntary segregation. It should be pointed out that the governor appeared genuinely committed to upgrading black schools, so that he was really shocked when the black delegation in the room came out with a ringing affirmation of the Brown decision. But in the aftermath of the Citizens Council crushing the school petition drive in 1955, some black leaders, particularly educators, began to see the advantages of getting new buildings, better pay for teachers and administrators, and free bus transportation for students. If no federal authority was going to enforce the court's decision in the Magnolia State, and there's no indication that either the courts or the executive branch was going to take any action, then why not take advantage of the state's predicament and reap some benefits? The state legislature met in special session and approved a 2-year, $88 million education budget, most of which was earmarked for black education. In subsequent years, additional funds were appropriated, financed by an increase in state sales and cigarette taxes. Over the next decade, progress was made in the area of equalizing black and white teacher salaries, construction of new school buildings for black children, consolidating one-room schools, and providing adequate transportation to many more black students than ever before. Decades later, when schools across the South were being increasingly resegregated, black activists began to speculate on the road not taken. In his book on Brown, Silent Covenants, Harvard Law School professor Derek Bell, who had worked on school desegregation cases in the 1960s, speculated that blacks would have been better served had the Supreme Court in 1954 moved to enforce separate but equal doctrine rather than require integrated education. Blacks in Mississippi have expressed similar sentiments. But a closer look at the record reveals that although whites brought about some improvements in black schools, the gap between black and white remained large and never would have been closed. For an example, an unpublished Mississippi Department of Education report in 1962 found that statewide the average schools district spent $4 in local instruction for every white school, for every white child, for every dollar expended on a black child. In some districts, particularly in the Delta, the gap was even wider. Tunica County, for example, spent $173 per white student and $6 for each black kid. The discriminatory allocation of funds then canceled out much of the potential for actual parity promised by the state's equalization program. Thus, as late as 1962, more than half of Mississippi's 638 black schools remained unaccredited, even by the relatively lax state standards, primarily because of poor libraries and, quote, abnormal teaching loads. Historian Charles Bolton, in his excellent book, The Hardest Deal of All, found that the black high school in Ruleville, Fannie Lou Hamer's hometown, in there, the library in '64 consisted of 6 incomplete sets of encyclopedias and a dictionary. A number of classes had more than 60 students, while 2 of them contained more than 75. So as the school equalization program moved along in fits and starts, black Mississippians, chastened by their attempts in 1955 to desegregate a handful of schools, filed no more local desegregation petitions for the next 8 years. There will be dramatic confrontations elsewhere. In Little Rock in 1957, when President Eisenhower was forced to send in federal troops because the state was openly defying the federal government. In New Orleans in 1960, when the nation witnessed the spectacle of angry white women screaming at little black girls as they attempted to walk to school. And at Ole Miss with Meredith in 1962. But even at that late date, white Southerners were confident they could keep their elementary and secondary schools racially pure. Regionally, 10 years after Brown, barely more than 1% of the 3 million black school-aged children living in the 11 southern states were attending school with whites. And throughout the rest of the 1960s, local freedom of choice plans, which again put the onus on black parents to put their kids on the line, avoided meaningful integration anywhere in the South. Perhaps one unintended consequence of Brown was that throughout the South, civil rights activity increased on other fronts, with local people feeling for the first time that the federal government had given at least some indication that it was on their side. In Mississippi, Medgar Evers led the NAACP through difficult times in the late 1950s when the Citizens Council was riding high. And in the early 1960s, the sit-ins and the freedom rides brought outside agitators into the Magnolia State. Organizers from the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and the new Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, moved into Mississippi and organized black communities around voter registration drives, culminating in the Freedom Summer of 1964, when upwards of 1,000 volunteers, most of them white college students, came down to Mississippi to assist local people and movement organizers in their attack on Jim Crow and all it stood for. 1964 also witnessed the first successful desegregation of Mississippi's elementary schools. Didn't come easily. Back in 1955, voters passed a constitutional amendment giving the state legislature the right to abolish the state's public schools rather than desegregate them. In March of 1964, when Judge Sidney Mize decreed that school boards in Jackson, Biloxi, and Harmony must submit school desegregation plans to be implemented in the fall, the Citizens Council breathed defiance, believing that, quote, "no education is better than integrated education." They actually said that. The council demanded that the targeted schools close rather than admit blacks. For the first time, however, the council's position was publicly challenged by a group of Mississippi white women led by Mary Ann Henderson, the wife of a political science professor at Millsaps College. Their organization, called Mississippians for Public Education, had as its sole public goal keeping the schools open. Although most all of the members favored school integration, for political reasons they took no stand on that question. Still, the Citizens Council attacked them with a vengeance and lobbied political leaders to take action to prevent any black child from attending a previously all-white school. The Citizens Council lost that battle and saw its influence in Mississippi decline thereafter. A number of elected officials in Jackson were willing to close the schools in the fall, but ironically, the tide turned when a manufacturing firm, Alice Chalmers, told the city fathers that they would cancel their plans to build a large factory in Jackson if there were no viable public school system. Freedom Summer and the national negative publicity that accompanied the Klan murders of 3 civil rights workers in Neshoba County also had an impact. The State Chamber of Commerce issued a statement saying that citizens should obey the new Civil Rights Act of 1964, even though they didn't like it, and call for peaceful desegregation of the schools. And that's what happened. When the schools opened in Jackson, Biloxi, and Harmony in September, there was no violence and the sky did not fall. The battle for school desegregation, however, was just beginning. For the next 5 years, the state operated under what was called the Freedom of Choice Plan, under which a student was supposedly allowed to attend any school in the district. But here again, it was black parents who had to take the initiative, signing up their children to walk into what they knew would be a hostile school environment. The result was that while schools across the state were desegregated, the number and percentage of black children in any one school was quite small. And they were subject to racial slurs, physical intimidation, and white teachers who at best ignored them in class. The worst trouble occurred in Grenada, where in the fall of 1966, on the first day of classes, black kids integrating white schools were set upon by a mob armed with axe handles, pipes, and chains. A Memphis reporter saw, quote, "some husky young men whipping a little Negro girl with pigtails. She was running. The men chased after her, whooping and leaping up and down like animals." Now, the violence directed against black students in Grenada was the worst in the 12 years since Brown, surpassing in ferocity the harassment of students in Little Rock in 1957 and New Orleans in 1960. Incidents that at the time led to public outrage. But by the fall of 1966, white Americans were growing tired of the continuing black protests in the South, and after a few angry editorials, the story disappeared. There were, however, some successes. Matthew and May Bertha Carter were sharecroppers, and they and their 13 children lived in the Delta town of Drew, not far from where Emmett Till had been murdered a decade earlier. Their house had no indoor plumbing. The entire family worked long hours in the cotton fields, and the children attended ill-equipped, badly staffed black schools. May Bertha, who had left school after the 5th grade, was determined that her kids would escape a lifetime of chopping and picking cotton. She took advantage of the local Freedom of Choice Plan and demanded that the white schools in Drew admit 7 of her children. 5 of them had already graduated from black schools, and 1 was not yet in school. School officials grudgingly complied. The Carter children were the only blacks attending white Drew schools that year. As Constance Curry has shown in her wonderful book on the Carter family, Silver Rights, the Carter children faced abuse at the white schools and one evening night riders riddled their house with bullets. But May Bertha concluded that the white teachers were basically fair and that her children were getting a better education than they would have in a black school. In 1968, the first of the 7 enrolled at Ole Miss. 6 more followed. All 7 graduated between 1972 and 1982. Nothing like this outcome could have been imagined in Mississippi before 1964. The experience of the Carter children was replicated in other towns and cities, but by and large, black parents did not choose to put their children at risk by sending them into a hostile school environment. They remembered Grenada. And a new idea was gaining ground among younger blacks. In 1966, SNCC activist Stokely Carmichael shocked white America when, on the Meredith March Against Fear, he raised the cry of Black Power. Although the slogan meant different things to different people, at its heart was the concept that black people should control their own institutions, including schools. Ever since Brown, African Americans had challenged the Supreme Court's belief that separate schools, quote, generate a feeling of inferiority in black students. Derek Bell has attacked the, quote, racially demeaning and unproven assumption that blacks must have a majority white presence in order to learn. But in the late 1960s, black nationalists were taking this a step further. Bob Moses, for example, had insisted that white students be invited to be part of the movement during Freedom Summer. He believed in the slogan, white and black and white together. 2 years later, however, he was asking, why can't we set up our own schools? Because when you come right down to it, why integrate their schools? What is it that you will learn in their schools? What black people really need to learn is how to get organized and work on the society to change it. By 1969, Mississippi whites had decided that they could tolerate a little bit of school desegregation if they could keep most blacks locked into their own schools. Black parents like the Carters had proven that integration did work, for their children at least, and nationalists like Carmichael were calling for black control of all institutions in their communities. Then, in October of 1969, a unanimous Supreme Court in a Mississippi case, Alexander v. Holmes County, ruled that, quote, all deliberate speed for desegregation is no longer permissible. The obligation of every school district is to terminate dual school systems at once and to operate unitary schools. Specifically, the court ordered all 33 school districts in the Alexander case to begin complete integration of their school systems after the Christmas holidays. Every other school district in Mississippi had to implement the Alexander decree by the fall of 1970. This was a bombshell. After Alexander, education in Mississippi would never be the same. Let me illustrate the effect of this court decision by looking at the public school system in Jackson, Mississippi, the state's largest city and state capital. And here the story gets personal. My family and I had moved to Mississippi in 1967, where I taught history at Tougaloo College. We had moved into town by the time of the Alexander decision, and our daughter Julie, a 5th grader, was in that first group of children to experience total integration. It was chaos. Desperate to keep whites from fleeing the public schools in droves, school officials tried innovative and expensive techniques like open classrooms, knocking out walls to create large common spaces, and individualized instructions using teaching machines. These measures were by and large unsuccessful, and white students started leaving the public schools in droves. When the first handful of black students attended Jackson schools in the fall of '64, the Citizens Council opened their own schools. But they were makeshift, unaccredited operations that did not attract good teachers or upwardly mobile white students. They were not known for their academic rigor. But in the aftermath of Alexander, enrollment at these council schools boomed. During the 1971-72 academic year, nearly 60% of Jackson's private schools attended Citizens Council school. Private school students attended Citizens Council schools. Other whites fleeing the Jackson schools transferred their children to one of 8 parochial schools in the city, which were generally desegregated but educated few blacks. Some moved out to the city to the white suburbs. Jackson's more affluent white citizens established Jackson Preparatory School, which soon boasted of the academic achievements of its students, including a number of National Merit Award finalists. But the tuition at Jackson Prep was steep, and most whites opted for less expensive alternatives. In the year following the Alexander decision, 10,000 whites, over 40%, abandoned the Jackson public schools, and that number grew rapidly as the years passed. Those whites who stayed in the public schools did so for a variety of reasons. Some were waiting to see whether the courts would back down as they had in the past. Others kept their children in the public schools because they were too poor to afford the tuition at even the council schools. And then there were people like us who believed in integration and were determined to stay the course, even though our kids might suffer in the process. This was a turbulent time for everyone with a stake in the school system. You literally chose your friends on the basis of where they sent their children to school. The same pattern followed in other areas where there were large concentrations of black school-age children. In Canton, just north of Jackson, nearly every one of the district's 1,200 white students left to go to the new Canton Academy early in 1970. The results were the same in Indianola and other Delta towns. Now, it should be pointed out that despite the flight of whites from public schools in black majority districts that took place in the 70s, most whites then and now continued to send their kids to public schools. In those areas where whites are a vast majority of the population, the public school system was relatively unaffected by the private school movement. Whites kept control over the school systems in all counties, even in schools where the vast majority of students were black. In these districts, white voters had little interest in allocating tax dollars to an educational system that no longer benefited them directly. In the aftermath of the Alexander decision, white-dominated school boards either fired or demoted black administrators. In 1970, Mississippi had 168 black principals. A year later, there were 19. Many became assistant principals in the desegregated schools. The same held true for coaches and band directors. As for the Supreme Court, in 1971 in Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg, the justices ruled that busing was a legitimate tool to achieve school desegregation. From that point on, the court under Warren Burger handed down a series of decisions detrimental to school desegregation, while President Richard Nixon instructed the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to abandon efforts to force compliance with desegregation decrees by cutting off federal funds to these districts. The Supreme Court in the 1990s, led by William Rehnquist, ruled that court-ordered busing plans could be dropped when schools became resegregated because of private choices, not public policy. But these and other decisions had little effect in Mississippi, where the die had been cast in the early 70s. Which brings us down to now. What's the state of public education in Mississippi today? The statistics are grim. In January of this year, Education Week released a report that put Mississippi 51st in student achievement in grades K through 12, behind the District of Columbia. Where blacks are a majority of the student population, white children almost exclusively attend private schools. In Jackson and in the Delta, the public school system is 98% black, and the state's graduation rate is one of the lowest in the nation. Especially of concern in Mississippi is the school-to-prison pipeline, where increasingly black male students are arrested and given jail terms for discipline offenses that used to be handled internally by the principal. Last month, the Jackson Clarion Ledger published this interesting factoid. Mississippi incarcerates a higher percentage of its population than Russia and China combined. 70% of the prison population is Black and Hispanic, 3/4 of whom were convicted of nonviolent crimes. And the average prison inmate has a 6th grade education. The school system situation isn't totally bleak. In Starkville, the home of Mississippi State University, a group of white and Black parents have organized to keep the public schools integrated. The schools are now 60% Black, but the 40% white enrollment has held fast for the past decade. And in Cleveland, in the Delta, there is a well-integrated high school on the edge of Delta State University. The county high school, however, remains overwhelmingly Black, and any attempt to merge the two schools would undoubtedly result in wholesale white flight. The majority white schools are all integrated, although the number of Blacks attending schools in more affluent suburban areas is quite small. Even most of the white private schools now have token racial integration in order to obtain a tax-exempt status. And the state universities are well integrated, as those of you who viewed the Egg Bowl game on last Saturday can testify. There are currently 32 African American undergraduates at Ole Miss and 3,400 at Mississippi State, constituting 20% of the student body. And that's not counting the football team. Finally, where does Brown v. Board of Education fit into all this? In my book on the Civil Rights Movement in Mississippi, I conclude that Brown did a lot more for the Civil Rights Movement than it did for education. In Mississippi, the modern Black freedom struggle began in the wake of Brown, as Blacks began to visualize a state and nation where they would be treated as first-class citizens, and they began organizing their communities to pursue that end. Fred Banks, a Black Mississippi attorney involved in many school cases, believes that the school integration fight was, quote, the major thrust in breaking the back of government apartheid in Mississippi. A leading legal scholar, J. Harvey Wilkinson III, wrote that, quote, very little could have been accomplished in mid-century America without the Supreme Court. Brown may be the most important social and legal event in America's 20th century history. That said, the question remains, did Brown achieve its stated goal of ending separate but unequal education with its implicit assumption that Black children would greatly benefit from attending integrated schools? In 1966, sociologist James Coleman headed up a research team that issued a report concluding that school integration in itself, quote, brings little influence on a child's achievement that is independent of his background and social context. The inequalities imposed on children by their home, neighborhood, and peer environment are carried along to become the inequalities with which they confront adult life at the end of school. Other studies and the passage of time have given credence to Coleman's then controversial findings. Today, in most Black majority school districts in Mississippi, African Americans have taken control with Black principals and school boards. Derek Bell was correct when he said that Blacks do not need to have a majority white presence in order to teach or learn effectively. But the major problems in these schools, and it's huge, is that due to white flight and the indifference of state government officials, these schools do not have the funding that they need in order to even have a chance to succeed. Add to this the fact that in many of these districts, so many of them, African Americans are living in abject poverty with all that implies, and you have a situation that demands resources that only the federal government can provide. Bob Moses, the acknowledged leader of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, left the United States in the late 1960s, taught school in Tanzania for more than a decade. Since he returned to this country, he has devoted his life to improving educational opportunity and outcomes for Black children. His algebra project in inner city schools has achieved remarkable results and won him a MacArthur Genius Award. For some time now, he has attacked what he calls the system of sharecropper education, foisted upon Black children in America, separate and woefully unequal. At Earlham College last month, Moses noted that while, thanks to the Brown decision, the U.S. Constitution no longer sanctions racial segregation by law, what is needed now is a constitutional amendment guaranteeing all students the right to a good education. And he has carried that message to audiences across the country. Given the current makeup of the U.S. Congress, passage of such a measure would have little chance for success. But the idea that the opportunity to obtain a quality education is in fact a human right is a goal worth striving for. And it is very much in the spirit of those dedicated Americans who fought to end racial apartheid in public education more than 6 decades ago. Thank you. I believe we have time for a couple of questions.
No. Thank you so much for your remarks. I am a daughter of Mississippi. My parents were 9 and 10 when Brown was decided, living 30 miles from where you lived in Jackson. It was so interesting to hear the outcome of the road not taken. They left Mississippi when they graduated from a Mississippi college in 1964 and went north. I am not from Mississippi.
You don't sound like it.
No, not quite. And my life, has been really different from theirs. If they'd stayed in Mississippi, I probably would not be a professor on this faculty. So thank you so much for that, for your remarks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm from Mississippi, and I attended Council School 11, Thomas
You
Jefferson.
sound like you're from Mississippi.
I just spent the last 6 weeks there, and I came up to be with my daughter who goes to school here. And I really enjoyed this. When she told me this was going to go on, I came, but nothing has changed. All my nieces and nephews attend private schools. The public schools have failing grades, and it was just really interesting. So
And where?
Natchez, Mississippi.
In Natchez, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember I was in the 3rd grade at Christmas time. My parents took me out of school while they arranged to put the schools together and at the churches while they were making a building. So I went to the 3rd grade at the Morgantown Baptist Church until they could get the building ready. I returned to the public schools in the 8th grade and got a great education and knew enough after I graduated from Southern Mississippi and got married to move my child out of state.
They also serve who stay in the state, but you two are good examples.
I am not from Mississippi.
I'm going to get my Mississippi hackles up again. I can talk about Indiana if you want me to.
I'll give you a chance to address a broader topic. So we've clearly seen the resegregation of schools with the sort of expiration of the school desegregation movement by the federal courts. We've gone through a number of equalization lawsuits and a number of rounds of equalization lawsuits. We've done the teacher minimum competency tests and tried to improve the performance of public school teachers. We've had the regime of accountability for the students, testing them, threatening teachers if the students don't perform well. And yet there's a tremendous problem with public education. So do you have any suggestions for where we go from here, or what do you see happening over the next 20 years in public education?
Yeah. I could say I'm a historian, I talk about the past, but that would be dodging it. As I said, I mean, you described it accurately. I mean, I really think that at some point there's going to have to be a huge initiative by the federal government not to control what is taught in every classroom, but to provide the resources. This is one of the things that came out of the Johnson administration and the Great Society, that lots of money was poured into schools. But more than that, it has to do with the need for an overall attack. I sound like an old-fashioned 60s person, of a war on poverty. That I think Coleman was right. Until you improve the conditions under which these kids go to school, why you're going to continue to have these kinds of problems. I mean, I'm in Greencastle, Indiana, which is an overwhelmingly white town, but poor white kids in the town had the same problems learning that poor black kids do in Mississippi. And yet no one in the larger population, my wife and others accepted, are doing much about that. So it's a class problem as well as a race problem, but I just am not optimistic about it being solved on the local level. One back here.
I appreciate your time. I like the idea of education being represented or being recognized as a right. How would that look in your vision?
Well, I think that you have, I just finished a book on an organization whose slogan was that healthcare is a human right, not a privilege. And I think that in the area of education, most people have assumed this all along. I think even the Tea Party would say that you need to have public schools, at least for some people. But what people haven't seen is that you're giving lip service to this idea, and you're not really doing the kinds of things that need to be done to improve the schools and to improve the lives of those who are attending them. So I think it would be something that you would take a national task force. You would have to have people throughout the country who are really committed to it. I think Bob Moses is a good example of somebody who's inspiring people all over the country with his message, but it's going to take time and effort.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Just a comment, a couple of comments really. One, I think my constitutional law scholars here can be precise about the dates. But I think that roughly around 1970 or so, to underscore your point about funding and whatnot, there was another Supreme Court case called Rodriguez versus San Antonio. Is that right? 73. And in that case, it was all about equal taxing. That if you can equalize the spending of tax money between and among school districts, that's what that suit was about. And underlying it was the whole idea of poverty is a suspect class. Race is a suspect class, but also poverty is a suspect class. And interestingly enough, I think that case went down 5-4. I mean, it lost 5-4. So at least in 73, that was still a very viable question. It was around the same time, since people have been talking a little bit, that I was roughly around that time that I was a law clerk in the Fifth Circuit. And the first case I worked on came out of Mississippi. And it was called Hawkins versus the town of Shaw. And what it was a municipal spending case. All of the roads that served the, in a sense, uncharacteristically segregated neighborhoods, because in the South sometimes that wasn't the case. But the segregated neighborhoods, the paved road would turn into a dirt road. Street lights would end in the white part of town, none. Fire hydrants in the white part of town, none. When I read this case as a law clerk, I mean, just reading the papers, I thought, this must have been made up. This is the kind of thing that you would make up in a law school classroom. and of course it wasn't. It was all proven. It was all in the record. And I remember the Mississippi lawyer who stood up in front of the Fifth Circuit, Judge Tuttle, Judge Wisdom, and Judge Goldberg.
Good judges.
Yeah, and he said, Your Honors, this is a heavy burden on my shoulders. and they ruled appropriately, but then it got entangled in this financial matter of can the courts deal, to tell somebody how to spend their money and tax money. It's one thing to divide, have a clean, bright line based on racial discrimination. It's another thing once you start getting into the funding issues. In any event, that's too long a comment, but I so appreciated your talk.
Well, thank you. And what has happened, of course, since then is that in most of these areas where you have majority black populations, the whites have all left town. They're out in the suburbs. You look at Jackson right now, and you find these affluent suburbs surrounding the place. So blacks are in control now, but there's no tax base to fix the streets. One of the things that a black mayor of Jackson, most recently, Tougaloo, who unfortunately died while in office, was to convince the majority of the citizens in that town for an increase in the sales tax just so they could fix the roads. I mean, that's the continuing condition of the situation in cities and major urban areas.
Yes, I am a first-year law student, and I'm from Florida, and my whole family is all from the South. My uncle was shot in the Orangeburg massacre.
Oh.
Yep. And so then my parents are older. I'm the youngest of 5. So my parents didn't have the chance to go to integrated schools until my dad went to law school. But in terms of, for his experience, was that he never had the chance to go to integrated schools till law school. Mm-hmm. So for undergrad, high school, he said it was very, very empowering versus the experience of his peers who were younger who then went to integrated schools who had negative experiences. So for him who had the positive experiences in a segregated school, and though he was all for integration, he never had a negative experience in a black school. So his psychological development was different because he was confident. He knew who he was. He knew his role models. But his peers, or his siblings who were younger, who had the chance to go to an integrated school in the late 60s, they were kind of jaded by their experience. So how do you kind of bridge that divide from those who had a positive experience and those, let's say, like a Clarence Thomas who talks bad about integration?
You've hit upon a very real problem, and that is the experiences of a lot of the children who integrated the schools. And there's a new book underway. It will be coming out within the next year or so that is essentially about the children who were in the first group to desegregate schools and also the children of civil rights workers. And all of them, in terms of the cause, very often went through very traumatic experiences and looking back on it said, I wouldn't do that again. On the other hand, you have so many more people who have across the country benefited from that. But I taught at Tougaloo, an all-black school. And when we got there in 1967, all of the students who at Tougaloo were the product of private school or public schools in Mississippi. And I taught students who were reading at the 5th grade level alongside students who'd be going to Harvard Medical School. So there's a success story there. But yeah, that divide between those who were before and after, and of course it depended on where you went to school too. There was a really good black high school in Jackson, but there in the rural areas, they had a lot of the schools that were still like the ones that I described. Thank you very much. Thank you.